HOA Karens have a special talent for confidence without comprehension. This one proved it by calling 911 on me over a lake she didn't own, didn't control, and didn't even legally touch. It started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the water is glass, still, and the only sound is a fishing line cutting the surface. My family had owned that lake for decades, not HOA owned, and not community access. Privately deeded water rights, shoreline included, filed with the county before the subdivision even existed, but Karen didn't care about deeds. She marched down the gravel path with a clipboard, reflective vest, and that tone, the one that assumes obedience before words leave her mouth. She told me I was required to pay a lake usage fee for fishing. I smiled, calmly. No, I'm not. That was it. That was the crime. Her face twitched. She flipped through laminated pages like they were spell books. She explained, slowly, that the HOA managed the lake, regulated access, and charged residents for use. I told her just as calmly that I wasn't part of her HOA. She smirked. Everyone here is. That's when I informed her I own the lake. Not rented, not leased, owned. She laughed. That laugh turned into fury when I refused to stop fishing, refused to show ID, and refused to acknowledge her authority. She threatened fines, liens, towing, trespassing charges. Then she did what HOA Karens do when reality won't cooperate. She called 911, loudly, right in front of me. She told the dispatcher there was a hostile man illegally occupying community property and refusing HOA compliance. She emphasized hostile while I stood there holding a fishing rod and a coffee. I said nothing. I kept fishing because I knew something she didn't. When the police arrived, Karen was vibrating with anticipation. She rehearsed her speech, pointed dramatically at me, and announced that she wanted me removed immediately. The officer asked a simple question, who owns the lake? Karen answered without hesitation. The HOA. I finally spoke. No, I do. I handed the officer a laminated copy of the property deed, the water rights certificate, and the county survey map showing the HOA boundary stopping 20 feet short of the shoreline. Karen went silent. The officer took his time, walked the shoreline, checked the parcel number, made a call. Karen's confidence drained with every second. Then the officer turned to her and asked, "Ma'am, why are you charging residents money to use property you don't own?" Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. That's when the real fun began. Karen tried to recover by doing what she always did, doubling down. She insisted the officer was mistaken. She said the HOA had historical control of the lake. She said the residents had been paying fees for years, which in her mind apparently transformed wishful thinking into ownership. The officer didn't argue. He just asked for proof. She handed him a binder full of HOA bylaws, color-coded tabs, and laminated rules about boating hours, fishing limits, and approved flotation devices. He flipped through it once, then closed it. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "HOA rules don't override recorded property deeds." That's when Karen's voice got sharp. She accused me of forging documents. She demanded I be detained. She told the officer she'd call his supervisor. The officer nodded politely and called his supervisor first. While we waited, he asked me a few questions. How long my family owned the lake, whether I had documentation filed with the county, and whether anyone had ever attempted to restrict access before. I answered calmly. Decades, yes, frequently. Karen overheard that last part and snapped. She admitted out loud that the HOA had been charging residents lake usage fees to fund landscaping, parties, and enforcement. The officer raised an eyebrow. "So you've been collecting money for access to property the HOA does not own." Karen realized too late what she'd said. When the sergeant arrived, the tone shifted from neighborhood dispute to legal problem. He reviewed the deed, checked the GIS overlay on his tablet, and confirmed it again. The lake, the dock, and the shoreline were entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. Then he asked Karen to step aside. She didn't like that. She demanded my citation. She asked why I wasn't being removed. She insisted the residents had rights. The sergeant explained something very slowly, the way you explain gravity to someone already mid-fall. "Ma'am, this is private property. You called 911 under false pretenses. You also appear to be collecting fees for access you don't control." Karen's face went pale. He asked her for the HOA treasurer's name, then the HOA president's, then whether the residents knew their fees weren't legally enforceable. She stopped talking. The officer turned to me and asked if I wanted to pursue charges for false reporting or trespass. I declined for now. I told him I preferred documentation. He smiled. They took statements, photos, copies. Body cam footage of Karen admitting to everything. They warned her, formally, not to return to the shoreline or interfere with my use of the lake again. She tried one last power move. She said she'd have the HOA attorney shut this down. The sergeant replied, "I'd recommend your attorney review the county records first." Karen stormed off, humiliated, vest flapping like a surrender flag. But that wasn't the end, because within a week, the HOA sent letters to residents announcing a temporary suspension of lake access due to legal clarification. That letter accidentally triggered something beautiful. Residents started asking questions. Where did their fees go? Why was access suddenly gone? Why did one homeowner control the lake? And that's when I made my next move. The HOA didn't realize it, but that temporary suspension letter was the match. Residents had been paying lake usage fees for years. Monthly add-ons quietly folded into their dues. Most of them assumed it was legitimate. After all, there were signs, rules, Karen with her clipboard. Authority theater works when no one questions the stage. Now they were questioning everything. My phone started ringing the same evening the letter went out. Neighbors I'd waved to for years suddenly wanted to talk. Some were polite, some were angry, a few were scared, because they'd paid thousands over time and realized they might have been conned. I kept my responses calm and factual. Yes, I own the lake. No, the HOA never had permission. Yes, I have the deeds, surveys, and county filings. No, I never charged anyone. That last answer bothered them the most. Within days, residents began requesting financial disclosures from the HOA. Karen tried to stonewall. She said the numbers were internal. She said they'd be released after legal review. That only made things worse. Someone leaked the budget spreadsheet. It showed years of collected lake fees categorized under recreation and amenities. The funds weren't earmarked for maintenance, they weren't reserved. They were spent on landscaping upgrades near the board members' homes, catered meetings, and a particularly expensive community retreat. The lake hadn't seen a dime. That spreadsheet hit the neighborhood Facebook group like a bomb. Karen logged in to defend herself. She claimed the HOA acted in good faith. She said ownership was ambiguous. She accused me, by name, of sabotaging community harmony. That's when I posted. I uploaded redacted copies of the deed. The survey, the county acknowledgement stamp, the officer's incident report number. I didn't insult anyone. I didn't threaten. I didn't editorialize. I let paperwork speak. Karen deleted the post. Too late. Screenshots spread. Residents started demanding refunds. Some threatened legal action. Others wanted emergency meetings. The HOA president tried to calm things down with a mass email promising transparency. Then the HOA attorney emailed me. He asked, very politely, if I'd consider granting the HOA an easement or access agreement to avoid further community disruption. I replied just as politely, no. I told him the HOA had trespassed, falsely reported me to police, and collected money under false pretenses. Any future access would require a formal lease, market rate compensation, and acknowledgement of ownership. He stopped writing. That's when the HOA tried something desperate. They sent Karen back. The summer sun shimmered off the lake as I was setting up my kayak. It had been a long week, and the last thing I wanted was a confrontation. Yet, almost on cue, HOA Karen appeared, her heels clacking against the dock like a warning bell. She had that look, the one that said she thought the world owed her something she hadn't earned. "Excuse me," she shouted, waving a clipboard. "You can't use the lake without paying the HOA usage fee." I looked up, feigning surprise. "Oh, really?" I said, leaning back and crossing my arms. "And how much is that fee again?" Karen's lips tightened. "It's $500 per day, and you must." I raised a hand to cut her off, my tone calm but deliberate. "I'm afraid I can't pay you, but perhaps you'd like to see the lake from the dock itself." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." That was my cue. I stayed perfectly still, as if waiting for her to make a move. But she didn't expect the next words. "I should mention, since you're insisting on enforcing rules, that I actually own this lake." The world seemed to pause. A bird cried out, startled, and the water rippled as if the lake itself had caught on to her panic. Karen blinked. Slowly, her hand dropped the clipboard. I don't understand. This is part of the HOA, yes," I said, calmly picking up a paddle, "and part of the HOA rules is that you respect property ownership. That includes the lake, which in this case is mine." Her face went from indignation to sheer disbelief, a combination I've grown to enjoy observing. She opened her mouth to speak but found no words. Then came the real kicker. 911, she yelled, fumbling for her phone. "I'm calling the police." I smiled serenely, letting the silence stretch. When the dispatcher answered, she explained that she was being threatened by a resident refusing to pay a lake fee. The calm in my voice as I answered was deliberate, almost theatrical. "Yes, hello," I said. "I own this property, including the lake. There's no fee, there's no crime, have a nice day." A long pause followed. I could almost hear the operator's mental gears turning, slowly realizing the absurdity of the complaint. Meanwhile, Karen was frozen, staring at her phone like it had suddenly betrayed her. She looked around, hoping for witnesses, perhaps expecting some invisible law enforcement to side with her. The only witnesses were a family of ducks, blissfully unaware of the HOA politics, gliding across my water. I decided to escalate the situation in the most legally satisfying way. Calmly, I retrieved a laminated copy of the property deed from my car. The paper gleamed in the sunlight, official and unyielding. I waved it gently, almost theatrically, in her direction. Karen's expression shifted from disbelief to panic. That's not possible." "Oh, it's very possible," I said, my tone steady, slightly amused, just enough to underline the irony. "You see, the rules of the HOA don't apply to private property owners. And since I own this lake, your fee is not just unnecessary, it's unenforceable." Her hands shook slightly, betraying her usually rigid composure. I think you need to. I cut her off politely, smiling like a teacher correcting a misbehaving student. "I think we understand each other perfectly. Perhaps you'd like to leave now before any further misunderstanding." At this point, she muttered something under her breath and stormed off, dragging her clipboard like it had personally offended her. I returned to my kayak, savoring the silence and the gentle lapping of the water. As I paddled out, I thought about the absurdity of it all. People like Karen live in a world dictated by arbitrary rules, completely oblivious to real authority, or in this case, my authority. She had called 911, expecting the law to side with her. Instead, she met reality, a calm, confident, slightly vengeful reality that didn't bend to her whims. By the time the sun dipped lower, painting the lake gold, I had charted a course across the water, each paddle stroke a reminder of the small victories we claim when others try to overstep. And Karen, well, she would have a story to tell her HOA friends, though none of it would help her collect a fee that didn't exist. The best part of this encounter wasn't the victory itself. It was watching someone fully convinced they held power realize that they had none, and they never would not hear, not on my lake, not anywhere I had true authority. The next morning, I arrived at the lake earlier than usual. The mist hovered just above the water, giving everything a surreal, almost cinematic quality. I noticed Karen's car parked at the entrance, not moving, engine idling like a coiled spring ready to explode. She had clearly returned, convinced that a single 911 call had not settled the score. I stepped out of my truck, coffee in hand, wearing the faintest smirk. "Morning, Karen." I called across the parking lot, voice calm, measured. "Back so soon?" Her eyes narrowed as she spun around. I just wanted to clarify the fee situation." She stammered, clipboard clutched like a lifeline. "I'm only trying to enforce HOA regulations." I raised a hand, deliberately patient. "I understand truly, but as I mentioned yesterday, this is my lake, private property. Your fee isn't just unnecessary, it has no legal weight." Her jaw tightened. "You can't just ignore HOA rules." "Of course I can," I said, smiling faintly. "Especially when the property in question is mine." Karen's hands shook as she scribbled on her clipboard, likely trying to figure out how to legally salvage her dignity. Then, she blurted out the line I'd been expecting. "I'm calling the cops again." I tilted my head, feigning mild concern. "Oh, wonderful, please do. I love watching authority work properly. Perhaps they'll finally explain the concept of property ownership to you." By now, a few neighbors were beginning to gather, drawn by the escalating drama. Karen, oblivious to the growing audience, fumbled with her phone again. I stayed calm, projecting the air of someone entirely untouchable, someone whose confidence was grounded in undeniable truth. Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher, and still she fiddled with her phone. I could hear her muttering, frustrated that law enforcement had yet to materialize at her command. The more she struggled, the smaller she seemed, her authority evaporating under the weight of reality. Finally, she stomped toward the dock. "You can't just," she yelled, voice rising, shaking the morning air. I motioned for her to calm down. Please, Karen, let's not ruin the serenity of the lake. You might strain your vocal cords trying to enforce what doesn't exist. Her face turned red, a mixture of anger and embarrassment. She finally raised the phone and shouted, "I'm reporting trespassing. He refuses to pay the HOA fee." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, then gently tapped my property deed, leaning it against a post on the dock so everyone could see. By all means, take your time, but you might want to read this first. It explains a few key things about ownership and fees. Neighbors began whispering among themselves, eyes flicking between Karen and me. It was beautiful, almost like a live demonstration in civics. I stayed calm, the very picture of composure, while Karen fumbled and stuttered under her own self-imposed pressure. She looked around, suddenly aware of the gathering crowd. You can't show that." "Oh, but I can," I said, my voice smooth and deliberate. "You see, everything is transparent here. The law favors facts, not intimidation, and facts are on my side." Karen's grip on the clipboard tightened, knuckles white. Then came the piece de resistance. She stormed toward the water, attempting to create a scene that might intimidate me into compliance, but I didn't flinch. Calm, composed, I simply adjusted my hat and gestured toward the lake. "You're welcome to stand here," I said, "but the lake, once again, is mine. Enjoy the view." The absurdity hit her. For a moment she froze, realizing that all her efforts, the calls, the threats, the loud proclamations, had accomplished nothing. Meanwhile, the neighbors began murmuring, some even chuckling quietly. At that moment, I felt a surge of satisfaction, not from anger or malice, but from sheer poetic justice. Karen had attempted to wield the power of the HOA like a weapon, but in trying to enforce fees on a lake she didn't own, she had essentially armed herself with empty threats. She tried one last desperate tactic. She waved her phone, shouting at me to leave the lake immediately. "I've got law enforcement on the way." I leaned on my paddle casually, tone perfectly calm. "By all means, wait for them. I'll stay here, enjoying the lake, until they arrive. I'm sure they'll clarify that the only trespassing here would be your assumptions about property ownership." And that was it. Karen's face was a mix of fury and disbelief. Her attempts at intimidation were collapsing like sandcastles at high tide. I had done nothing aggressive, nothing vengeful in the moment, just pure, unshakable truth. As she backed away, muttering under her breath, I dipped the paddle into the lake. The water shimmered, catching the sunlight, reflecting calm authority. Each ripple seemed to whisper, "Reality always wins." By mid-morning, word had clearly spread about the lake incident. A small crowd of curious neighbors gathered along the shoreline, drawn by whispers of HOA drama and a confrontation gone spectacularly wrong. Karen, ever persistent, paced back and forth, muttering about fees, regulations, and penalties, each word evaporating into the morning air like smoke. I stayed in my kayak, calm, letting the tension build naturally. "Good morning, everyone," I called to the neighbors casually. "Feel free to enjoy the lake. Just remember it's private property, so no fees apply." Karen's eyes widened at the growing audience. She tried to project authority, raising her clipboard dramatically. "He's refusing to pay. This is a violation of HOA rules." One neighbor, a retired lawyer, stepped forward. "Excuse me, Karen, did you read the property deed? This lake is clearly owned by him." Karen sputtered, muttering something about enforcement and precedent, but her words held no weight. Every attempt she made to intimidate or shame me was met with polite, calm confidence. Then came the real escalation. She shouted into her phone, calling 911 for a third time. "This man refuses to comply with HOA rules. I demand enforcement." I calmly spoke to the dispatcher once again. "Hello, I own this lake. There is no fee and no crime is taking place. Thank you." The silence after my words was almost tangible. Karen's face turned red with fury and humiliation, and the neighbors exchanged knowing glances, some stifling laughter. Her efforts to wield authority were collapsing under the weight of reality. Frustrated, Karen tried one last tactic. She waved her clipboard at the crowd. "You have to listen. He's breaking the rules." I leaned back in the kayak, taking a slow sip of coffee, projecting calm authority. "You're welcome to stand here and argue, but the facts remain unchanged. Ownership matters more than arbitrary fees." Her posture faltered, her words lost meaning, and the absurdity of her attempts became painfully obvious. Finally, with a dramatic huff, she stormed back to her car, muttering threats under her breath. The neighbors watched, amused and impressed at how gracefully I had diffused the situation without aggression. The lake was calm again, the water reflecting the sunlight in gentle ripples. Each stroke of my paddle reminded me that patience and factual authority always triumph over unfounded intimidation. Karen had tried every trick she knew, calls to law enforcement, shouting, public posturing, and failed spectacularly. By the afternoon, the neighborhood chatter had turned to admiration for the quiet, confident victory. Karen had become a cautionary tale. Persistence without understanding authority only leads to humiliation, and I, serene on the water, had demonstrated the ultimate art of malicious compliance, enforcing reality without lifting a finger in anger. The best part wasn't just winning, it was watching the narrative unravel for her while I remained composed. Karen had called 911 multiple times, tried to shame me publicly, and still achieved nothing. The lake, the water, and the law were on my side. Reality had done the work, and I had only to remain patient, calm, and unwavering. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Karen returned once more, probably hoping for a last-ditch victory. This time she appeared flustered, clutching her phone and clipboard, muttering about reporting and consequences. I stayed in my kayak, watching the lake shimmer in gold and orange light, my demeanor calm, composed, and unshakable. Back again, Karen, I called casually. The lake remains private property. No fees apply. Her jaw dropped. This isn't fair. HOA rules. I raised a hand politely. The rules apply where they can. Here, ownership governs. Please enjoy the lake from the shore if you wish. No further action is necessary. She fumed silently, pacing along the edge of the lake like a caged animal. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, likely reminders of her failed 911 calls. The neighbors, now accustomed to her antics, watched quietly. Some nodded in approval, others smiled knowingly. In a final attempt to assert control, she shouted again, waving her clipboard. I'm enforcing the HOA. You can't, Karen. I interrupted gently, voice calm and deliberate. The lake is mine. There is no fee. The law is clear. Repeating yourself will not change reality. Her expression shifted from rage to disbelief. For a moment, I could see the realization settling in. All her efforts had been futile. She had attempted intimidation, manipulation, public shaming, and repeated calls to authorities, yet nothing had worked. The lake remained mine. The facts were immutable. I paddled slowly toward the center of the lake, letting the distance reinforce my authority. Karen watched helpless. The sunlight glinted off the water, casting her in a harsh silhouette of defeat. She had tried to bend the world to her will, and the world, calm, impartial, and factual, had refused. Finally, she turned and walked away, muttering under her breath. The parking lot emptied, the neighbors dispersed, and the lake fell silent, broken only by gentle lapping water and the distant calls of birds. I leaned back in the kayak, savoring the tranquility. The confrontation had been resolved not by anger, not by conflict, but by calm, confident assertion of truth. Karen's persistent attempts had only highlighted her lack of authority, and the audience, witnesses, neighbors, and the quiet water, had seen it all. As twilight descended, the lake shimmered in silver and violet. I docked the kayak, carefully lifting it out of the water, reflecting on the encounter. The true victory was subtle yet complete. The law had been upheld, my property respected, and Karen's ego thoroughly deflated. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simple: patience, truth, and calm authority. Karen had forced her own humiliation, and I had done nothing but exist in alignment with the facts. The lake was mine, the water was mine, and reality had acted as my ally. As I walked away from the dock, the final lesson was clear. Attempts to impose authority without understanding the foundations of power are destined to fail. And when they do, a calm observer can enjoy the exquisite satisfaction of watching reality restore balance, one ripple at a time.